The end of the Pendulum Wars wasn't peace. Not really. Just a momentary silence, a lull in the storm. What the world called a ceasefire was little more than a curtain pulled over decades of ruin. For 80 unbroken years, the planet of Sera had been locked in a war that touched every corner of its soil. Not just between two factions, but across every single border, inside every single home. Entire generations were born into conflict, and they were raised by it, shaped by it. Every family on both sides of the divide had paid a price. Some lost sons, others lost fathers. Many had names carved into stone, memorialized in places few could come to bear to visit. To say there was a personal stake in the Pendulum Wars for damn near everybody wasn't just an understatement, it was a reality. It was normal. Both societies were shaped by that war. The UIR and the COG turned their schools into factories. They rebuilt classrooms not to teach history but to mold it. They taught duty, loyalty, sacrifice. They taught children that the enemy was just across the border, or sometimes right across the street. Marcus Phoenix was one of those children. He came up through Olafson Intermediate School, a COG-run school like thousands of others all over the coalition of ordered governments, each one carefully engineered to raise the next generation of gears. They didn't teach rebellion. What they taught was obedience. They didn't teach individuality. They taught unity. That was every citizen. That every citizen was just one part of something larger, one cog in the whole machine. And at the heart of it, they taught one simple truth. Gears fight for freedom. Gears die for democracy. The UIR is the enemy. For generations, an entire planet had been taught to hate each other, taught to see the world in lines drawn by borders, defined by flags. That hatred wasn't abstract, it was deeply personal. People didn't just believe the enemy was dangerous, they knew it. As the war raged on, both sides lost brothers, sisters, friends, to bombs, to bullets, to decades of war that never let up. You didn't need propaganda when grief did the teaching. And then the war just ended. After 80 relentless years, an armistice was declared. One speech, sporadic parades to welcome home, those finally returning. And for others, just silence. A stunned, unfamiliar quiet. The world tried to pivot, tried to remember what peace felt like, but it was impossible. When generations of sons, fathers, grandfathers served in the military, spoke of camaraderie, spoke of the enemy that tried to take their life and how a brother stepped in and made the ultimate sacrifice with his life, and that it was the ultimate honor for you as a kid to carry on your family's legacy in the continuation of that fight. The shift is incomprehensible. The demobilization that swept the planet, seeing armies dissolved, economies shift, soldiers were told to go home, entire governments collapsed or were absorbed, the UIR ceased to exist. The COG, once one side of a war, became the side, the only global superpower left, and its culture was a strong militaristic one. So to embrace peace, even as a victor, still felt abnormal. But the real struggle didn't just come from the personal day-to-day adjustments, it came with a fragile effort to rebuild. To transition from decades of trauma into something resembling normal life. To integrate enemies, stabilize nations, and stitch a broken world back together. For 2 short weeks, humanity let out a breath it had been holding for a century. People dared to believe again. Enough time had passed that they started to somewhat relax, to hope, to believe in their children, in the next generation, that these kids won't have to fight, that won't have to endure the same pain, trauma, and anger towards an enemy just across the border. They hoped again. And that's what made what happened next so horrifying. Because this wasn't just a military ambush. It wasn't just the fall of a single city. It was the shattering of an entire planet, recovering, of healing, of accepting peace. E-Day had been recounted many times before, but never like this. Because to understand its impact, you have to understand what the world was finally starting to feel. Not victory, not conquest, not celebration, but just relief. A collective exhale after nearly ending itself through warheads, firestorms, and desperation. And then, from beneath the earth, the screaming began again. The war was over, or at least that's what the world told itself. After 80 years of fire, ash, and sacrifice, the Pendulum Wars had ended in surrender. The UIR fractured under the weight of a defeat. Its states either absorbed into the coalition or left in limbo. The COG didn't just win, it became the world. a single superpower rising from the rubble, tasked with stitching civilization back together. Demobilization came fast. Units were dissolved, veterans were discharged, the great engines of war that had thundered for nearly a continued century finally slowed. Soldiers traded rifles for paperwork. Ships that were meant to be decommissioned and scrapped but held off due to the Pendulum Wars were expedited to be scrapped now, and the planet collectively braced itself to welcome home soldiers. Politically, the COG, now the only government, did its best to rekindle relationships with former UIR states. Enemies they hated with every fiber of their being was now being treated as a neighbor. The COG launched strenuous efforts to rebuild cities they had vaporized or annihilated during the war, and in some areas, even attempted to help repopulate areas formerly seen as either no man's lands or so devastated from war it just became uninhabitable due to constant shelling. Yes, there was still anger, still resentment, especially on a personal level. Too many scars were still fresh, but the greater government of the COG committed to reunification with absolute urgency, because they believed the only way peace could truly hold was if it came from one voice, one machine, one effort that stretched across every single border, no matter how bloodstained. Demobilizing the army wasn't just a policy, it was symbolism to them. It was the COG telling its people, it's over, you can go home now. That it was finally okay to put the rifles down, to sit beside their children, to feel safe enough to raise them. After all, those were the people you were fighting for. Not glory, not revenge, but the hope that someone else wouldn't have to pick up a weapon next. And now, that moment had arrived. Yes, the speed of it alienated many, especially gears like Bernadette Mataki and Victor Hoffman, who had known nothing but war their entire adult lives. But to the COG, that whiplash was worth it. Better to overwhelm their own soldiers with peace than to risk letting bitterness fester between former enemies now asked to live as neighbors. The second aim of demobilization was even more delicate, to show the former UIR states that this wasn't a victor's peace, but a shared one. To signal that whatever came next, they'd face it together. Both sides of the invisible victor's parade were welcoming people home. Both sides were mourning the dead, and both were now working together for peace. The first 4 weeks were relentless. Public handshakes, state visits, pardons for former enemies of the state, allowing them to return home. COG and UIR statesmen walked side by side. Former soldiers, those more willing anyways, who once aimed rifles at each other now shared drinks, speeches, awkward jokes. By the 6th week, something had shifted. There were no whispers of sabotage, no rumors of UIR defectors, no border states quietly cutting themselves off, nothing. And after what the Pendulum Wars had trained the world to expect, that silence was everything. For many, it felt like confirmation that maybe this peace was genuine. Those 6 weeks without incident was a kind of eternity. And politicians still showing up in former war zones, still shaking hands, still pledging unity, it all had to mean something. Some genuinely believed the nightmare was over. Others, the more reluctant ones anyways, weren't so sure. For them, it wasn't the peace they struggled to accept, it was just the adjustment. Bernadette Mataki was one of them. She was just one gear among thousands, if not millions, who'd gone from being somebody to nobody at all. She knew this day would come, if she wasn't killed first, but she didn't think the day would come like this so fast. One moment, she was elite infantry, a specialist, a platoon sniper with a role, a rank, and a family that bled together. She was the elite of the elites, and had to say she was somebody, and the next it was gone. Wounded, medically discharged, turned away from the regimental life she had lived in since she was 18. 27 years of service, 20 of them were on the front lines, and suddenly she was back on the same farm she had grown up on. But she still missed the smoke, the grit, the order of Ephyra, the capital of Tyrus, the main nation of the COG, the transition, the hustle and bustle of military life to now being stranded on a lone island, the farm she grew up on, where she would only see her neighbors weeks at a time as opposed to living in cramped barracks with other people, was brutal. She wore the role of civilian life like an ill-fitting coat, one she didn't ask for and couldn't take off. Officially, she was retired Royal 26, RTI, the Unvanquished, one of, if not the most prestigious unit in the entire coalition. In her mind, she still wore that uniform. She'd spent a lifetime becoming a gear, and no armistice was going to undo that overnight. That kind of disorientation of being unmade wasn't unique to Bernie. Her medical discharge made the separation sharper, more immediate, but the feeling itself echoed across both sides of the armistice. Gears who had known nothing but orders, barracks, battlefields, now found themselves staring down quiet lives, with no war to return to, even if they seemed to want it. The uniforms came off, but the purpose didn't come back. The war had ended, yes, but for many veterans like Bernie, the stillness was just another kind of wound. But not everyone struggled with it. Augustus Cole was relieved, maybe even thrilled. For over a year, he'd argued with his agent and with his mother about enlisting. As the rising star of the Cougars thrashball team, everyone around him thought he was out of his mind. He had fame, money, an unmatched future, and still, he felt the pull, like he owed something. Like he had to do his part. But now, the war was over. 6 weeks into the armistice in his hometown of Hanover was in celebration mode almost every single day. Every time another gear came home, the entire city lit up. Parades, streamers, welcome home banners flapping across storefronts and train platforms. The street sweepers couldn't keep up. When celebration would end, the ribbons would be cleared, and by morning a new convoy was rolling in, and it began all over again. It was about finally being able to just stay. And in that excitement, he found himself looking over a contract from the Sharks, rivals of the Cougars. A big offer, a lot more money, but the numbers didn't matter. What mattered was home, the city of Hanover, a city that felt like one big family reunion, a place where he could play for the people who raised him, where his parents could live close, safe, cared for, and proud. He was already looking into a penthouse apartment for them, but it wasn't for the luxury, it was just the proximity. And because he was getting paid more than he ever needed, why not splurge on his parents a little? Because frankly, Cole didn't want to leave again. Not now, not after what the world had just survived, and not when home finally felt like something worth holding on to. On the far side of the world, Dizzy Wallin found himself caught between relief and unease. His return home, like Bernie's and Cole's, was colored by the silence of peace, but unlike them, Dizzy had spent the war at sea. He was a merchant mariner, a lifeline in constant danger. For decades, cog tankers like his were prime targets, relentlessly hunted by UIR submarines. 80 years of shadow games beneath the waves. And yet now, for the first time in his life, his ship moved through open water unescorted. No destroyers, no sonar sweeps, just calm seas and clear skies. It felt wrong. The ocean had never been this quiet. Sure, minesweepers would be scouring the deep for the next 50 years, but there were so many of them out there already, you could almost believe the seas belonged to humanity again. To him, that did matter. It meant rebuilding wasn't a fantasy, it was already underway, even out here on the water where the ocean was often seen as an afterthought. Still, old habits were hard to shake. Every night, Dizzy slid a life jacket underneath his pillow just in case. Some rituals die slow. Maybe someday that fear would fade. Maybe one day he'd sleep like a man who wasn't waiting to drown due to his ship being attacked by some enemy beneath the waves. But for now, his thoughts weren't on the water, they were on home, on North Sheriff. His stepson Richie had just come back last week, one of thousands released under the COG's rapid demobilization effort. Dizzy hadn't seen the boy in years, and the dread of losing him or being lost himself had made that absence feel like a lifetime. Now they both had a chance to live, to laugh, to celebrate, and Dizzy aimed to get home as fast as the wind could carry him. He just had to deliver this tanker to the largest refinery on Sera, Porto Ogari, offload the tanker's emulsion, and then he was free to see his wife Lena and their son Richie together. But then it happened. The world broke, not with a declaration, but with confusion. Across 3 corners of the planet, 3 soldiers, or soon-to-be soldiers, Bernadette Mataki, Augustus Cole, and Dizzy Wallin heard the same unthinkable news, but told in different ways. At first, it felt like any other day. Cole sat in traffic on Centennial Bridge, surrounded by a sea of idling cars. The war was over, the convoys were gone, and yet the highway had choked to a standstill. He figured it was just another welcome home parade though, another batch of gears returning from the front. Hanover had been in celebration mode for weeks now. Streamers, flags, parades that seemed to just never stop. Bumper-to-bumper traffic didn't even faze him. But then he looked out across the water. The bay was still, too still. No waves, no wind, no seagulls riding the thermals or screaming over the bridge. Even the cables, normally lined with birds this time of day, were empty. Cole chuckled to himself. Maybe the birds were off partying too. And then his thoughts drifted back to Jannermont. His parents were due to arrive from there soon, and he still hadn't figured out how to convince them to accept the penthouse he'd lined up for them. Too nice, they'd say, too much, but it wasn't about the luxury for him, it was just about keeping them close, safe, near him. And his driver spoke up. He mentioned how something's going on, that the radio is acting weird. This entire time, he's been fiddling with it and Cole hadn't been paying attention. The static had blended into the background until one word cut through the noise. Evacuate. Cole leaned forward. He'd ask if he heard that word correctly. And as his driver struggled to turn up the volume, he explained he was trying to get a traffic report. Every station is just static though. Nothing's coming through except for one. And it was a faint signal. From what it sounded like, it claimed Jannermont's under attack, that they are evacuating the city. The name hit like a punch to the gut. Jannermont. That was where his parents lived. Cole instinctively would do what everybody else across the entire COG would actually come to do. Ask if it was the Indies. Did the UIR hit back? Did they go back on the armistice? Did they wait patiently for 6 weeks just to retaliate against the COG when everybody's guard was down? His driver didn't answer right away. Instead, he kept fiddling with the tuner, trying to lock onto the signal. And finally, he spoke up. He said, no, the radio's not saying it's the UIR. They have no idea what's going on, but whatever's happening, the reports currently coming in are claiming they're coming from underground. Hidden in disbelief, Cole turned his head and looked around at the other drivers. Nobody was honking. Nobody was shouting. Everybody sat frozen, faces bathed in the soft glow of radio dashboards, all staring, listening, waiting. The voice on the radio, faint again, came back. It sounded as if the reporter on the other end was breathless, and he sounded as if he was in the middle of some street somewhere, attempting to grab people as they ran by him. He threw out questions of what they saw, what they heard, doing his best to grab anybody until finally a woman's voice answered. She was rattled and breathless herself. Between her panting, the faint signal, the yelling in the background, and from what sounded like artillery fire behind them, it was that much more harder to hear her. But Cole could make out somewhat of what she said. She said they came out from underneath. They just tore through the street like it wasn't there. The reporter asked if they were armed and what they looked like. The woman, sounding as if she never actually stopped moving and at this point is pushing the reporter forward, responded by saying, yeah, armed, they're huge, scaled, gray. I don't know what they are, just that they weren't human. Now please, I just need to get home. And then the feed died. Cole slumped back in his seat. It sounded fake, like some radio drama or viral stunt, even a bad trailer to a movie. But he knew it wasn't. You can feel it in the air, in the silence, in the feed. And then a different voice came on, calmer, a little more stable signal, and it sounded as if he was from a studio. There was no music, no tone, just dread held back by protocol. He'd go on to explain that they've lost the link to the former feed that people were listening to. It was the only somewhat stable feed they were able to hold for an extended period of time. It seems communications all across the COG, at least, are having severe trouble. News crews have been sent out and they're cutting in and out intermittently, or they just haven't reported back at all. But he'll try to do his best to recap this morning's developments. From his current understanding, they're receiving unconfirmed reports of widespread attacks across Tyrus by some kind of animal or alien species that's emerged from underground. Casualties are currently unknown, but eyewitness accounts, those that managed to somewhat get through, suggest the loss of life is substantial. Similar attacks are being reported right across Sera, and the chairman is due to make a statement sometime shortly, but in the meantime, citizens are advised to remain indoors and keep roads clear for emergency services. People are going to need them. And then the feed cut out once more. Overwhelmed, Cole leaned forward in his seat and told the driver he needed a phone. Now, Jannermont was under attack. His parents were there. He had to know if they were alive. The driver didn't hesitate. He veered into the center divider, weaving between stunned traffic and surging down the shoulder like it was wartime again. After a few frantic turns, they found a garage still open. Cole jumped out before the car fully stopped. While he bolted inside to find a line, the driver kept the engine running, just in case they needed to get out fast. Inside, Cole picked up the receiver. Nothing. No dial tone, just a cold, repeating message of how the service is unavailable. A sterile beep echoed in his ear, hollow and final. He stepped back outside, shaken, where the driver muttered underneath his breath, eyes wide, something about aliens, about the radio. If Cole believed what they were saying, but Cole wasn't listening. His mind was racing, his heart pounding. Jannermont wasn't just a name on a map. It was his parents, his blood, his world. He couldn't sit still. He told the driver to go, to find his own family, that staying here was a mistake. They both knew it. Before the man could even reply, Cole was gone, sprinting. His legs carried him down the block, his body moving on instinct alone. Somewhere nearby, he remembered, there was an electronics shop. Maybe they had a radio feed, a television, anything. As he ran, the silence unnerved him. The streets were abandoned, parked cars left in a hurry, doors ajar, engines still warm. No sirens, no crowds, just an eerie hush, like the city had exhaled and never breathed in again. And then he turned the corner. They hadn't been attacked here. Instead, the entire neighborhood had converged outside a small electronics store. Faces pressed to the glass, radios crackling, televisions flickering in the window. A crowd stood shoulder to shoulder, clinging to whatever scraps of information they could gather. Normally, Cole would have drawn attention. A star like him couldn't walk the streets unnoticed. But today was different. Not in this. Not when the world was coming apart again. He stood behind the crowd, towering over them, forgotten in the fear. And on the TV in front of them, hell played out in black and white. The footage was grainy, probably pulled from an old traffic cam. A time code showed it was from about an hour ago. It showed a highway. The highway, the major road into Jannermont. Cole knew it like the back of his hand. At first, everything looked normal. Cars cruising, trucks in the slow lane. And then, without warning, the ground ruptured. A jagged fissure tore through the asphalt like someone had ripped the spine out of the earth. Vehicles flew, bodies were launched from their cars, and for a second it looked like just an earthquake. Unreal, surreal, and then they came out from the hole. Figures, not human but walking like them. 2 arms, 2 legs, rifles in hand, and then they started firing. Someone sprinted across the camera's frame. They dropped. Another stumbled. The feed stuttered, blurred, and then it just went black. The image snapped back to his studio. The news anchor didn't speak right away. He looked like someone just trying not to panic. A crawl across the bottom of the screen simply listed cities. Ephyra, Ema, Kelowna, Jannermont, Surrogar, Portagari, Vasgar, places on both sides of the pendulum line, former UIR and COG, all confirmed hits or had just gone silent. No one in the crowd made a sound. These people had seen war. They'd seen firestorms, orbital strikes, mass graves, but this was different. This wasn't war, this was something else. And then someone finally spoke. A man's voice, quiet and cracked. All he said was, "They're everywhere. What the hell are they?" A woman followed, more angry than afraid. "Why now? The war just ended. Where's the COG? What are they doing? What's the government doing? Why did they wait 6 weeks after peace?" But no one answered. How could any of them? And in that moment, Augustus Cole, the Cole Train, thrashball star, hometown hero, wasn't a celebrity. He wasn't a soldier. He was just another scared human being staring into the unknown. But scared or not, he knew it had to be done. He needed to find his parents, to get them somewhere safe, into the penthouse if he had to drag them, lock the doors, stay low. Then he thought about his agent. Was he still holding that contract, still waiting in some office, watching the same nightmare unfold? Either way, none of it mattered now. The money, the fans, the game, it was over. Everything had changed, and somewhere underneath all of it, they were still coming. Back on the island of Galangi, the news arrived differently. Not in screams or chaos, but in silence. First, the television went dark. Then the radio. Both going out at once was strange, but not unheard of. The South Islands were notorious for unreliable reception, especially in stormy seasons. At first, Bernie figured she or Neil could ferry across to Nora and sort it out. Maybe a transmitter was out. Maybe they'd just bring a tech back to the house. It wasn't urgent, not yet, and that kind of isolation had always been a part of life out here. And for the first time in weeks, Bernie was trying to just settle into being back home. She and Neil were just sitting down to have lunch. He was trying to coax her into opening up about the adjustment, about the silence, about what it was doing to her. And then the phone rang. It was Dale, their neighbor on the other end of the island, a few clicks away. It was the closest person they had to company. Neil answered while Bernie stayed at the table, only catching fragments of the conversation, but whatever was being said drained the color from Neil's face. When he finally returned, he looked like a ghost. He'd mutter that it started again. The war. They hit Ephyra, and no one can get through to Nora, the closest major city to them. Bernie froze. She would ask if it was the Indies. Was it really the UIR acting up again? The question felt automatic, the only possibility that made any kind of sense to her anyways. Her mind, from there, began to race. Ephyra was far, but not impossibly far. If she got the next ferry, got to Nora's military airfield, she might still make it in no time. Her unit might still need her, but something still didn't add up. How the hell would Dale know this? She asked. If the TV's out and the radio's out for them, it's not like he's got a direct line to the chairman. Neil would explain that Dale had been monitoring an emergency band, something local from the Harbor Authority, a backup frequency he kept for storms or outages. What he caught wasn't official, but it was panicked. fractured, but clear enough. Ephira had been attacked, the threat came from underground, and whatever did it wasn't human. Hundreds of miles away, aboard the Benton-Court Star, Dizzy Wallin was still riding the high of relief. His ship was coming closer to port, inching into Porta Agari, where he would just offload his emulsion shipment and finally return home to North Sheriff. He was almost home. Dizzy hadn't seen his stepson in years, and that was all his mind was on. All he wanted now was to be there, to sit at the table again besides his wife Lena and Richie, and laugh like the war had never happened. And then a flash caught his eye. It shimmered along the coastline, subtle, sharp. For a second, he thought it was the sunrise, or maybe the refinery, flaring off excess gas again. But the light stayed with him, wrong somehow. He lifted his binoculars and swept across the skyline. The refinery was still a few clicks out, but he spotted the telltale trail of vapor from one of its towers. Then he saw it, a small port authority boat barreling across the waves at full throttle. At first, he thought nothing of it, just the harbor pilot heading to meet them. But the boat wasn't coming towards the Star, it was headed parallel to the coast, away from them. And then the ship's collision alarm screamed. Startled, he looked to the realm, expecting Rob, the first officer, to be smirking, maybe having hit the wrong control, or intentionally messing with Dizzy, but Rob wasn't laughing. He was waving Dizzy up, urgently. As Dizzy climbed, he listened for engine issues. Maybe it was a mechanical fault. He cursed under his breath, imagining a blown valve or a fried sensor that might trap them in port for days. But when he reached the bridge, everything changed. The entire crew was gathered around the radio. Rob had the headset, one thumb covering over the transmit button. A faint crackling voice played overhead. Dizzy caught fragments, but it was enough. The voice said they were under attack. The port is shutting down. To get out now. Another voice crackled through. It was a voice from the Audacious claiming they were en route and would be there in 15 minutes to help with the evacuation of the port. The Audacious, Dizzy knew, was a warship. Naval Coalition NCOG, active duty, and that wasn't standard. Dizzy began to ask what the hell was going on, and Rob looked up, simply saying that they've started again. The Indies, those bastard Indies. The crew fell into stunned silence. Dizzy felt like the air had been punched from his chest. All he could think about was Richie, freshly home, possibly already recalled. It hadn't even been 2 months for the armistice to settle. He asked what the UIR had done now, but no one had answers. Rob tried to hail the refinery again over the radio. It took a minute, but they responded. The harbor master simply said that the situation at the port was bad, and to divert to the military port at Cape Alis immediately. And the harbor master cut out. That led to more questions. Where's the attacks? Why no sirens? Where's the news? They began to look at the neighboring town, and they didn't hear any gunfire. They didn't see any extra explosions. They didn't see any smoke or any other telltale signs of an active attack ongoing. There was no helicopters, no enemy forces. I mean, it was just the refinery. And the refinery itself was over 1,000 clicks to the nearest UIR border. So even then, how the hell would they manage to get this far inland with any type of weaponry or explosives without anyone noticing? And then a flash of light came again. This time not a shimmer, a clear, defined explosion. It rocked the skyline. A fireball rolled through the refinery towers, sending plumes of smoke curling into the sky. A second later, the sound hit them like thunder. One of the engineers whispered quietly under the breath that they're hitting all of the refineries. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. And then a teeny voice from a handheld radio crackled through the silence. It was Dolan, the cook. He'd been fiddling with the personal unit trying to scan any working signal. The transmission from the handheld was faint just like everything else, and even a little damaged, but something in it changed him. He turned to the crew, pale and distant, and told them, it's not them, it's not the Indies. The quartermaster growled at him. Of course it is, it's the only enemies the COG would have. And then Dolan struggled with the words that they say they're not human. Naturally, a few of the crew laughed nervously. Someone joked about mutant seals. Others asked if maybe the Goraznians were launching a last-ditch push. After all, they were still technically at war with them, as Goraznia was the only major UIR nation that refused to accept the ceasefire. But Dolan didn't laugh. He just explained that what he hears is that no one knows what they are, but they know that they aren't Indies. The UIR isn't responsible for these attacks. And then the intercom crackled, this time clearly. The entire crew was summoned to the bridge. Chairman DeYille was making a public address. 20 hardened merchant sailors crammed into the bridge. They could have listened from their bunks, but nobody wanted to be alone. It felt like in that moment they just needed each other. Not out of training, not out of protocol, but just out of pure terror. DeYille's voice came through clean. controlled, and from Dizzy's perspective, a little too calm considering the words he was delivering. He'd go on to address the citizens and explain that they don't know what these creatures are. All they know for sure is that they are not human. Nobody knows where they come from or what they want, but they are tunneling under our cities and emerging to slaughter our people. Our combined forces are mobilizing all across Sera. He asks everyone to just remain calm, as they have done so through over 80 years of war. He concludes the speech by just saying for people to stay in their homes unless they are directly ordered to evacuate, and to monitor all broadcasts for emergency information. That is all he can currently say until the situation becomes clearer to them as a whole. And then the transmission ended. Silence swallowed the room. For a moment, no one breathed. The weight of those words, "not human," hung in the air like smoke. Dizzy's thoughts turned to Lena, to Richie, to North Sheriff. He needed to reach them. He needed to know. He asked if others knew any confirmed places that were hit, and the only response was Jannermont is the only confirmed one with major casualties. As of now, it is the hardest hit, with no official casualty count yet. But in that moment, everybody knew, all across Sera, it wasn't just a tragedy contained to Jannermont. Will Carmine was just another gear that day, a soldier finally on his way home. He sat slouched on a bench inside the base armory, the war already beginning to fade into photographs, images of friends, comrades, and fire teams, some of them long gone, lost to the never-ending grind of the Pendulum Wars, others still living, but trapped in the same strange limbo Will now found himself in, trying to figure out what it meant to move on. He was part of the latest wave of demobilization. After years of service, he turned in his papers and was preparing to return every last piece of COG-issued equipment. Rifle, armor, sidearm, helmets, the works. The COG hadn't trained him for anything outside of war. Like most gears, he had no trade, nothing to fall back on. His best idea was finding work as an engineer on some freighter out at Port Farrell or Vescar, something quiet, something far. As he laid out his gear piece by piece, the armorer beside him, an old vet named Dane, kept making small talk, reminiscing, joking about how surreal it just all felt after 80 years for everyone to just be at peace, to see rifles being locked up, gear tags submitted, and uniforms handed over and never expected to be reclaimed again. This time there was no deployment papers waiting, no new orders, nothing, just a thank you and a silence. Will chuckled at the thought. He came from a line of soldiers. His father served in the early years of the war, his grandfather before him. He figured he'd be next to send his own kids off to fight, which is exactly why he never had any. He didn't want to continue that type of cycle. He didn't need his children inheriting that kind of non-stop war. But now there was peace, or at least something like it. Enough for him to start dreaming about something quieter. No medals, no parades, just a cabin on a freighter. A long horizon, and time just to figure out who the hell he was without a lancer in his hands. He signed off the final checklist and joked with Dane about retiring the old gear. Neither of the men noticed the subtle vibrations in the floor beneath their boots. Not until it was too late. The shaking came fast, violent. Before Will could move, the ground directly behind him caved inward, ripping open a jagged hole in the armory floor. Two gears behind him were nearly pulled in. One lost his footing, barely grabbing the edge thanks to the other's help. They both skidded back just in time. Will turned, stunned, and for a second, all four just stared into the abyss, peering into the black void of where the concrete had just collapsed. They saw nothing at first, just sparks, a flickering of light, then a low rumble, then it came. A massive clawed appendage, curved like a sickle, shot from the abyss and impaled the gear standing directly beside Will. The man didn't even scream. He was lifted off the ground, twitching, before being hurled aside like scrap. Another gear tried to raise his weapon, but the limb came back, slicing clean through his torso, damn near exploding his entire body. With so much force, his blood sprayed the lockers, snapping back into what years of hardened warfare in the Pendulum Wars trained him to do. Will dove. He yelled out, called to Dane to throw him his weapon. Dane didn't hesitate. He tossed the freshly checked lancer, and Will caught it mid-roll, slamming himself behind one of the structural pillars to lay down cover fire. But it didn't matter. Whatever this thing was, bullets didn't affect it. And then the same mandible-like limb crashed into the pillar, shattered it, crushed Dane where he crouched behind it, split clean through by the creature's next strike. Will didn't even have time to reload. Before he could even react to everything going on, something grabbed him from behind. A scaled hand, inhuman strength. It dragged him off the floor like a doll and drove a jagged blade or more like a living sword straight through his chin. His lancer fell at the clatter. Blood soaked the floor. Then it got worse. Elsewhere in the complex, seconds later or maybe at the same time, two more massive breaches tore open the main courtyard and command plaza. The same creatures poured through, emerging from tunnels like a swarm, opening fire. There was no warning, no pattern, just pure slaughter. The first wave moved like infantry, fast, coordinated, merciless. Their rifles were brutal, shredding anything that moved. Others took high ground, perched on rooftops, cranes, even the upper walkways of hangars, firing with terrifying accuracy, as if they'd been training. The COG never stood a chance. Snipers were taken out in seconds. Fire teams were cut down before they could even regroup. Communications went dark almost immediately across the entire compound. Orders collapsed into screaming. Soldiers scrambled, diving for cover, retreating into barracks, hangars, anywhere with walls. But it didn't matter. Any form of logic, the idea of backing yourself up against walls so that way you can assess the situation directly in front of you and where the enemy was coming from, wasn't viable here, because the enemy didn't come from one direction. They came from everywhere. Armories, med bays, command towers, places built to withstand sieges, all became death traps. The airfields became killing fields. There were no fallback points, no counteroffensives, just chaos, confusion, and ultimately massacre. Ravens are already in the air and never made it back. Some were hit mid-ascent, their hulls shredded by coordinated small arms fire from creatures fanned across rooftops and crater walls, which were positions they assumed within a matter of seconds. Other Ravens simply vanished, plummeting into flames before anyone knew what the hell hit them. The final transmissions were garbled, rushed. The only message that actually made it through was a warning, one that offered no details, no explanation, no enemy name. Just a single phrase: Jannermont is under attack. And then silence. What happened to Jannermont wasn't a skirmish. It wasn't even a battle. It was extermination. And the lockers were still open. A final haunting image of rows of weapons half returned. Gear tags left unsigned. Soldiers caught mid-demobilization. Uniforms barely collecting dust from the Pendulum Wars. Never expecting to fight another war again. Jannermont's fall wasn't just tragic either, it was catastrophic. The military complex was widely believed to be the largest one on all of Sera, and it collapsed within minutes. And with it, the city immediately fell. It was a densely populated civilian hub with no other defenses, no warning, no time. In fact, it was horribly naked, thanks to the massive demobilization effort. And once the military complex fell, what began as a strike on a base became a slaughter of an entire city. Retired soldiers on leave, families, children, mothers with strollers, veterans from the early days of the Pendulum Wars, enjoying the sun with their grandkids. None were spared. The enemy didn't distinguish, it didn't hesitate, it just consumed. Wave after wave poured through the fractures in the earth. Gray, scaled, brutal. The kind of force no one had prepared for. The kind of force the Pendulum Wars never even unleashed against its own species. The kind of horror that didn't ask questions, didn't demand surrender, just simply erased. And by the time anyone realized it was more than an isolated attack, Jannermont was long gone. All across Sera, the ground betrayed humanity. Subway systems, abandoned sewers, forgotten fissures and natural cave lines. Some routes were naturally carved centuries ago through just evolution, others dug deliberately by hands unseen in the coming days. It didn't matter, the result was the same. An invasion from beneath. While Jannermont was vanishing in real time, other cities began to fall or stumble. Kelowna, Ephyra, Porta Agari, Ema. These weren't random strikes, these were coordinated surgical attacks. A simultaneous dismantling of population centers, supply hubs, and cultural capitals. The kind of cities that didn't just hold people, they held meaning, and the COG scrambled to respond. Now, keep in mind, scrambling wasn't in their nature. This was a government forged in the furnace of an 80-year war. Discipline, control, clarity defined it. The COG didn't, never panicked. Not even when a UIR missile barrage slipped past radar. Not when naval fleets vanished. Even in the darkest moments, the machine always moved. But on this day, that machine seized up. Communications dropped almost immediately. Radio towers lost. Military outposts dark. Civilian lines reduced to static. Calls for help echoed into silence. Even internal COG command struggled to get bearings. Entire cities were just gone. Some were overrun before anyone could even make contact. And yet, people did move. All across the former front lines, soldiers who had barely returned home were already turning around. Gears re-enlisted themselves without orders. Reservists fell in with old units. Some didn't even wait for uniforms, they just grabbed rifles and joined convoys, headed in any direction that sounded like they needed help. Despite nobody knowing what the hell they were walking into, just that it was happening everywhere. Was it a natural disaster? Were they under attack? Who was the enemy? What did they have? Roughly an hour after Jannermont went silent was when Chairman Thomas de Yule made his first public address. He called for calm, assured the people that order would be restored. He didn't name the enemy because he simply couldn't. But behind that televised composure was pure chaos. The COG, for the first time in generations, didn't have any answers. Units were deployed and then they just vanished. Some returned with tales of monsters, others didn't return at all. All that could be resalvaged of that unit was just intercepted transmissions that were garbled fragments, gunfire, screaming, incoherent shouting, entire platoons broken mid-sentence. And in the quiet afterward, fear just settled in. Because whatever this was, all signs pointed to it not being human, and that made it worse. The absence of a known enemy, the lack of a motive, the complete erasure of logic in warfare. For 80 years, the COG had prepared for every threat. Missile strike, chemical attacks, assassinations, catastrophe after catastrophe, but this was different. This was apocalyptic, and the COG wasn't built for apocalypse, especially not one like this, where its origins were steeped in myth. Within hours, the government summoned the most brilliant scientific minds on the planet, not for war strategy, but for identification. The scientists weren't asked to win a war, they were told to just explain it. How is this possible? Are they real? Where did they come from? How do we communicate with them? These were the questions that echoed through every command center, broadcast studio, and war room across Sera. Not tactical assessments, not strategic analysis, just raw disbelief, clashing against the weight of reality. While Gears fought, regrouped, bled, and in many cases died, trying to reestablish something resembling a front line, teams of scientists moved in behind them, not to build a new weapon, not to design countermeasures, but to just retrieve bodies. The order was clear for them. Recover whatever you can. Get something, anything that might be able to help explain what the hell humanity is currently fighting. But that was easier said than done. The world was unraveling. Cities were falling within minutes, not even hours. Civilians were dying or disappearing, cut off, surrounded, or buried underneath rubble. Infrastructure collapsed. Safe zones turned into slaughterhouses. Even the most hardened military convoys were being ambushed or swallowed whole. The scientists became a priority not because they could stop the war, but because they might be the only ones who could define it. And that priority came with other costs. The retrieval of these alien or animal cadavers became such a high priority that Gears had to sacrifice saving civilians in order to just protect the scientists to retrieve the bodies. And even after days of desperate operations, of dodging artillery, chaos, and sheer panic, and making the tough choices of saving the scientists over a group of civilians, the scientists only recovered 6 cadavers. 6. That's all humanity had to work with. 6 broken bodies of an enemy no one could name. There was no captured soldiers, no intercepted communications, no demands or declarations of war. Just 6 charred remains and unspeakable violence. They dissected what they could, analyzed every fragment of tissue, every trace of blood, every grotesque variation in anatomy. The results? Inconclusive. The creatures shared some strands of DNA with humans, but so did nearly every living organism on Sera. So that explained nothing, offered no real insight, no answers, only more questions. Because no matter how elite the COG had once been, no matter how efficient or ruthless their war machine had become, you can't fight what you don't understand. And in the earliest hours of Emergence Day, they understood nothing. In fact, they would come to realize that resorting to routine or what used to work in the past doesn't always work. Chairman Thomas de Yule's orders to stay home, particularly in the city of Ema, was a death sentence. Civilians have been trained for millennia in the COG to do as you're told, to obey, to respect, and to just listen. And during the time of apocalypse, everybody did so. And so the order to stay home, all that did was allow this new enemy to rip holes inside people's homes, slaughter entire neighborhoods, without others knowing that the enemy has already breached behind what was believed to be the front lines. When it was learned that a neighbor or a few neighborhoods over This new enemy had emerged and was killing everybody in sight. That drove even more panic, more chaos. Refugees and evacuees exploded. Many people would rather take their chances dodging artillery fire and open gunfire than having their throats slit in their bed. That panic, that fear made everything 1,000 times worse for the government, for the military, and even for other people just looking for loved ones. It took humanity 3 days to even come up with names for the enemies, the Locust. And the name didn't even come from command. It wasn't stamped on an official order or broadcast from some polished cog podium. It came from the ground, from the mud, from the mouths of terrified soldiers and shell-shocked civilians. People who didn't know what they were fighting, only that they needed something to call it, some kind of identifier. Because when everything falls apart, names are how you survive. You name the fire, so you can run from it. You name the enemy so you can tell someone where to aim. High Command offered nothing, no clarity, no leadership, no answers. The machine that had once run on discipline, hierarchy, and control, the machine that trained children to obey before they could question, had failed. And the worst part, this wasn't the end. It was just the opening act. There was no after E-Day. This wasn't a natural disaster. There were no coordinated relief efforts. No slow counted casualty tolls tempered by headlines about the bravery of first responders. There was no pause. There was no victory. There was just more. The first 26 hours weren't the worst of it. They were just the warning. They showed how fast the enemy could move, how surgical their strikes were, how easily they could break Sera's strongest cities and reduce the rest to panic. From that moment forward, humanity became reactive, desperate. The cog, despite all its structure and ritual, was no longer leading anything. It was trying to contain everything, holding lines where it could, evacuating cities too late, maintaining the illusion of control even as an entire province at a time vanished without warning. It became a war not just for survival, but for the illusion of order. Refugees streamed into cities already choking with the displaced. Families begged for information where their loved ones had been sent off to. What transports were they on? What cities still stood? But even the officers didn't know. Entire towns had gone silent and no one knew about how much of the map was still left. Dizzy Wallin knew what that felt like. For 3 days, he trekked across Sera on foot, by train, by stolen vehicles. Anything that moved, trying to get home to Matino Junction in New Sheriff. He wasn't even sure what he'd find. He feared Richie, his stepson, might have re-enlisted out of instinct or guilt, that he'd answered a call no one should have picked up. But Dizzy's greater fear was about his wife, Lena, that she'd be left behind, left alone to face the end of the world by herself. By the time he reached the high ridge line that overlooked Matino, it was already too late. The town below was gone. From a distance, it looked like fog at first, a low-hanging bank of mist curling over the rooftops, but Dizzy knew better. It was smoke, thick, rolling, endless. As he climbed the final stretch of highway, the sky warped. Smoke trailed into the heavens, suffocating the sun. Black plumes poured out of what used to be towers, and beneath that smoke, buried beneath that shroud, was everything he had left. Matino was gone, and so, he thought, was his family. At the sight of the destruction, he almost threw up right there. The grief didn't come in waves, it came like a hammer, but he wasn't ready to stop. Not yet. He pushed on. Then the sound of a horn snapped him out of it. A cog pack horse transport came rolling up behind him. It was polar camouflage, black and white patched with gray. It stood out like a bad joke in the green hills of Tyrus. The kind of vehicle meant for snowbound cliffs, not farmland, not for a city. The kind of thing you only deployed when you had no other options. The driver flagged Dizzy down, asked him where he was headed. Dizzy responded with what anyone else would say, that his family was in Matino, his wife and boy, and his son was a gear, Richie Wallin. Out of courtesy, the gear would ask what regiment Dizzy's son was in. He turned to the radio as if to report, and then he turned back to Dizzy. He told him Matino Junction had been hit in the early hours of the first day. It was cut off, overrun. Gears were still fighting down there, but barely. Anyone evacuated had been rerouted to Corin, if they made it out at all, but Dizzy didn't care. He said he was going in anyway. He had to find out for himself, but the gear stopped him. He was young, polite, but extremely tired. He blocked the road. He told Dizzy he'd get him inside the pack horse, that he wasn't going to let him walk to his death. He made it known to him that that town down below was gone. Even if he found the house, what then? What if his wife wasn't there? What if the house wasn't there? What if he found nothing? The hospital was gone. The schools, the market square, the streets were nothing but ruin and echo. Everything had been reduced to fire, ash, and ruin. And even the gears fighting valiantly down there sound as if they're dropping in droves. Dizzy relented. Not because he believed the gear, but because he didn't have the strength left to fight. He hasn't eaten or drank anything in over 3 days. By his counts, he hasn't even taken a piss in 13 hours. He was just determined to find his family. The gear helped him into the transport. Inside, there were half a dozen gears already sitting, helmets in their laps. Most of them stared, straight, silent, exhausted, but too scared to sleep. Dizzy didn't need a mirror to know how bad he looked. He was dehydrated and starving, and again, he hadn't slept in days. But to him, he still wasn't dead, and that meant he had no excuse to give up looking for his family. One of the gears handed him a soda and a protein bar. They told him to just relax. They'll get him the answers he's after, but things are just chaotic right now. People are still being accounted for. The COG Bureau of Casualties, a line that has been established well during the Pendulum Wars era, is flooded with phone calls as it is. Civilians could have no hope of identifying if their loved ones are found, and gears are having problems communicating with their own comrades. He hoped, in some strange way, that Dizzy can understand that everybody was suffering in the same way. He wasn't isolated, he wasn't alone in his pain or in his terror. As the young gear in the back did his best to calm Dizzy down, the one up front that helped him into the transport turned around. He took his helmet off and his face was pale. His voice was quiet. He simply told Dizzy that he was sorry. Richie Wallin, they logged his tags. He didn't make it. With that news, Dizzy sat in silence for the rest of the ride to the city of Andis, a city not too far off that was housing a massive refugee center. The gears Dizzy was riding with said that they would drop him off so that way he can log himself in as a refugee and they can go from there. In the meantime, they need to get back to base and regroup with whatever remained of their unit. In Andis, the refugee center was pure chaos. It was a repurposed sports complex overflowing with the wounded, the lost, and the forgotten. Hundreds of thousands of people packed into a space meant for tens of thousands at most. The smell of vomit, sweat, and fear clung to every surface. Children screamed. Elderly lay curled in corners. Nobody had answers. Everyone had questions. Questions that even the staff had no answers for. Dizzy waited for hours just to be logged. Eventually he passed out, curled up on a patch of tile floor. When he woke, it wasn't a nightmare. It was just a horrible reality setting in further. He woke up to a woman in a police auxiliary uniform. She looked like she hadn't slept in weeks herself. She turned over Dizzy's COG tags in her hand and crouched beside him. She spoke softly. She simply said, "Mr. Wallin, I'm so sorry, but we found your wife." A few days later, back in Hanover, Augustus Cole stood on the edge of Cougar Stadium. The stands were already filling, the air thick with music, floodlights, and the rising roar of fans. If you didn't know any better, you'd think the world hadn't changed at all. The horrors outside the city hadn't arrived yet. That part of Sera was weirdly still intact. At this point, it's been 5 days since E-Day, and Hanover had been extraordinarily lucky. It hadn't witnessed any attacks, no sirens, no evacuation orders. It hadn't even experienced refugee caravans choking the streets, no screams carried by the wind. It was an untouched paradise by contrast. But even without fire or blood, it carried a different kind of weight, an eerie stillness, a collective holding of breath. The thrashball game that was about to unfold had been approved by the chairman himself. It was part of a broader COG effort to maintain appearances, order, normalcy, morale. The COG pulled every resource available to make sure that this was a televised performance, not just for a nation, but for as much of the world that was still able to experience it, trying to pretend the ground wasn't collapsing beneath it. And to some, it did work. To others, especially Cole, it didn't. By now, his parents had been confirmed among the dead in Jannermont. All that remained were the pieces, their home vaporized, their voices gone, their absence deafening. The penthouse Cole had bought them now felt like a horrible joke, a glass tomb filled with memories of people who would never come. He wasn't in Hanover to play, he wasn't even here for the crowd. He came to say goodbye. His decision to enlist was polarizing to say the least. His agent, his team, even the chairman's office, all of them pressed him to stay, not just for safety but for symbolism. Thrashball was hope. Cole was hope. His presence on the field let people believe the world was still turning. But that was exactly why Cole knew he had to leave, because pretending it hadn't happened was worse than facing it. And so just minutes before kickoff, he stepped out onto the field, not in uniform but in solemn black. The crowd rose on instinct, cheering, clapping, chanting his name before even a word was said. Then the PA dropped, the stadium hushed, and Cole took the mic. He didn't make a show of it, he didn't speak as a star, he spoke as a son. He thanked them, Hanover, the Cougars, every fan who made him who he was. This was home, he said. It always would be, but home was burning, and he couldn't stand here and pretend it wasn't. He wasn't playing tonight. He wouldn't again, because he had to help. He had to go. He promised he'd be back someday, and when he was, he hoped there would be something to come back to. He handed off the mic and walked back down the tunnel, choking back tears. In his absence, the crowd erupted Coltrane. They chanted, not as fans, but as something deeper. A rallying cry, a mantra for a world slipping into nightmare. In the days that followed, Hanover's enlistment numbers skyrocketed. Volunteers joining the COG army surged nearly 400%. Cole wasn't just a symbol anymore, he was a movement. A reminder that the fight wasn't over, and that one, not even a star, could outrun the gravity of war. Back on the island of Galangi, the war took a different shape. A week had passed since E-Day. Bernadette Mataki had already packed her gear, her uniform, her rifle, her tags, all laid out like they had never been put away. For days, she moved through the house like a soldier in the barracks, the television playing the news at all hours, volume low but constant. The signal had just come back to the South Islands, and Bernie kept it on, not out of curiosity but out of instinct. A sentinel listening for marching boots she could no longer hear. Her mind was fixed on one thing: getting back to the fight. She wanted to be in the major city of Jacinto. She wanted the mainland. She wanted her unit, the Royal 26th Tyrant Infantry, her brothers and sisters, her purpose. But fate doesn't care about purpose. She began organizing transport, anything to get her off the island. Ferries came once a month in the best of times, and now with the world cracking open, there were no schedules. No guarantees, just dock workers making judgment calls and hoping the sea stayed quiet just long enough to cross. Before she could even secure a way out though, the island council got to her first. They asked her to stay. Not as a soldier, not as a sniper, but as something else entirely, a leader. Galangi was small, barely more than a village by mainland standards. The Greater South Islands chain held maybe 1,500 people total. Fishermen, farmers, boatwrights, a few old veterans if any at all, and not a single operating garrison within sight. No command structure, no communications grid beyond shortwave and rumor. And with the mainland and all the main nations across the entire planet of Sera seemingly fighting for its life, no one believed that the army would detach any men or any decent, let alone significant force to defend this tiny speck of land that these South Islands were. And so Bernie technically was still the only active gear within 100 clicks. And while many believed the ocean would protect them, that the Locust couldn't or wouldn't cross water, others weren't so sure, and they wanted a plan just in case. So Bernie stayed, not because she was afraid to go, but because these people didn't stand a chance without her, and she knew it. She began organizing what she could, coordinated basic drills, created weapon stashes, requisitioned old boats to serve as mobile watch points between the islands. Most of the locals had a rifle or some type of shotgun passed down from either earlier wars or just the fact that they were farmers and had them on hand. So she turned those tools and these people into an armed militia. It wasn't much, no armor, no orders, no backup, but it was better than nothing. She wanted to be in Jacinto. She wanted to be on the front line. She wanted to bleed beside the gears who taught her how to fight. Instead, she stood on windswept cliffs, learning to watch the horizon for movement, teaching farmers how to reload under pressure, teaching children how to stay quiet when the ground rumbled. She didn't feel heroic. She felt stranded, but duty doesn't always look like glory, and on Galangi, Bernadette Mataki was still a soldier, just one with a different kind of war to fight. The true death toll of Emergence Day will never be known, but the most accepted estimate was that 1 in every 4 human perished on the first day alone. A quarter of the total human population across the entire planet erased before they even knew what they were dying to. Cities didn't fall, they were consumed. Entire family lines vanished without a trace. Regions gone without warning. Every major population center, especially in the east, was hit with such ferocity that casualty lists were outdated the moment they were compiled. And by the time names were read, the cities were long reduced to ash. And yet, as the weeks dragged on, the COG did what it always had, adapted, but not fast enough, not well enough, just enough to just continue. Gears were retrained in real time. Civilians were handed emergency drills, how to hide, how to listen for the ground, how to tell if the soil beneath you was shifting, how to tell if it was already too late. Propaganda shifted from pride to survival. Remember Kelowna? Posters began to read, referencing one of the worst civilian death tolls in modern history. Others pushed people to simply keep fighting. Other posters came with the purpose of just educating. Such quotes of "if they come from below, we send them back deeper," or "to watch for seismic activity," became rallying cries, but beneath every slogan was silence, and under that silence was uncontainable fear, because the truth was unavoidable. Humanity was losing, not just battle, not just ground, but the very ability to define the war it was in. The Locust didn't issue demands, didn't claim territory, didn't want anything. They didn't conquer cities and reuse them for themselves. Instead, they cleared them and moved on. From everyone's perspective, it just seems like they came to purely erase, and slowly they did. For every soldier enlisted, 10 more were lost. For every plan made, a city disappeared before it could be enacted. The COG wasn't leading a war, it was just surviving one. And as the months bled into a year, a darker slogan began to spread. Not in press briefings, not in broadcasts, but in whispers among the refugees and even the gears working relentlessly to save humanity. They began to whisper that the lucky ones died on E-Day because they never had to see what came next. They never watched the world unravel by inches. They never had to watch children train with weapons their parents once carried, or grabbing weapons blood-stained, covered in dirt, ash, and whatever remained of a loved one. How could you possibly be told to carry on when the weapon forced into your hands isn't just the weapon? It's not the only thing protecting you from the enemy, but it's the last remaining relic of a loved one you had just seconds ago. When that's your reality, it's hard to consider yourself lucky. And the people that died on E-Day, they never saw cities light up in flames. Not because they were under attack, but because the COG set them ablaze themselves. 1 year and 1 month after Emergence Day, the final lines were collapsing. There were no bunkers left, no fallback zones, no safe havens. Military elite, rich politicians, celebrities with numerous wealth, the homeless, middle class and lower class, it didn't matter. Nowhere was safe. Everyone was counting a total of days. Even in Tyrus, the heart of the coalition, was believed to have a total of a month of a lifespan before it was completely overrun. And so, facing those odds, the newly instated chairman, Richard Prescott, young, unproven, desperate, made the only decision he had left: to fight apocalypse with apocalypse. And so he ordered the deployment of the Hammer of Dawn, a relic of the Pendulum Wars, a weapon so powerful it was locked away out of the fear it would end humanity itself. It was actually deployed very briefly against the UIR. It was the very reason why humanity shuddered so quickly from war, because it was a weapon of untold destruction that the people that engineered it immediately regretted it. Watching just a few ships go up at sea against a weapon you know there's no defense from was more than just difficult on their conscience, it was detrimental. And in the wake of the Locust horde, Prescott didn't hesitate. With a single command, he deployed it. The sky turned to fire, and over 90% of whatever remained of humanity was burned alive. Cities incinerated, landscapes scoured, entire provinces sacrificed, not to stop the Locust. COG High Command knew they weren't stopping them. It was just to slow them down. To show the enemy one terrifying truth: if humanity couldn't have the world, neither could they. But the hammer didn't fall from nowhere. It was a weapon that had to be earned, stolen, fought for. In the next video, we'll return to the final days of the Pendulum Wars, when the coalition of ordered governments launched a suicide mission to seize a weapon that didn't just win a war. In a few years, that weapon gave humanity a second chance at survival. In the next video, we'll tackle Operation Leveler, the Battle of Aspho Point, and the day Marcus Phoenix and Dominic Santiago became soldiers of legend, heroes of the COG, albeit at a deep personal cost, long before any Locust emerged.